So we got the band back together to record another dialogue, or trilogue actually. Myself, my good friends Adam Robbert and Jesse Estrin had a wide-ranging conversation, initially responding to this interview in the online magazine Palladium that Marco Bauer did with Benjamin Breton on Breton's notion of terraforming. Very interesting piece that I'll link to in the discussion. And from there, we were somewhat wide-ranging, but it all connects, talking about the economy and our political situation, the role of technology in the human present and future, just trying to make sense of the trajectory we're on in light of history.
I'm recording a bunch of stuff starting on Monday morning. The first session is with the editors from Palladium. That's why I've been reading through their stuff. That's when I found the Breton, Benjamin. Is it Breton?
I think Breton. Like, yeah, I was enjoying that article. Actually, I didn't fully finish it. I don't know if you got a chance to look at it, Jesse.
But I glanced at just a couple minutes.
Yeah, it's neat. He's playing a little fast and loose with some really big philosophical names that I wasn't so sure about sometimes. But the overall idea of terraforming is something we should be thinking about as what we're already doing to the Earth.
Yeah.
Or rather, what's already happening to the Earth and us. And the question of if it's an intentional thing or not is an interesting question to ask. And whether we should be more intentional or like, I see him sort of critiquing this romantic idea that we need to just not be so hyper-technological and rather return to some sort of, I don't know, pastoral type of existence. I don't know what like deep ecology people imagine. Some of them are pretty anti-human and just think the Earth would be better off without us. And I do appreciate at least the resistance he's showing to that and saying, well, technology is not going away and maybe we're going to go extinct, but we could actually just give another go at like intentionally engaging in an intelligent way with a plan to try to get ourselves out of this mess.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know. It was a stimulating read. I don't really know where I stand. I feel like I'm increasingly overwhelmed by the complexity of the situation.
Yeah.
And a lot of ideas sound plausible in that kind of context.
Well, what kind of like looped it into our conversation for me was he was talking about how we had this kind of revolutionary moment in thinking in, roughly the 1960s that took shape, philosophically and socially and technologically and, all of these things kind of emerging at the same time in like that kind of post-68 landscape, and that had, a few kind of axioms, like we need to interrogate this notion of rationality and hierarchy and like the orderliness of society. Like the orderliness is in fact very unjust, and we have to do all of this like kind of uprooting of systems and rethinking, kind of putting rationality, in its place and kind of undermining it in all of these ways. And how that there's a way that mentality is kind of still operating, but almost on like autopilot, and doesn't actually even see its own victory, and doesn't actually even see that like that mission was kind of accomplished, in terms of like the intelligentsia and the academy and, in the press. And like, we're kind of living in that paradigm now.
Yeah.
That paradigm still believes itself to be kind of like the avant-garde and the thing that needs to take power. It like kind of missed the spot where it kind of claimed power, like it won, it culturally. And now we need to kind of like revisit, the kind of, maybe, I don't know, not necessarily like an enlightenment return. It's not that kind of thing, but like we need to rethink. One, we need like a kind of a speculative philosophy, a bigger speculative philosophy that is kind of like constructing notions of system and order about what the world is and about what the human is, you know, like new cosmology, new anthropology, and then like revisit like the role of rationality and all of that. And I just to even point to the fact that, you know, and he's saying like, it's not like that the 68 philosophies were bad. He's saying he's a student of them, but that's no longer kind of where the energy is. And I think that connects with, you know, a lot of what, you know, people criticize, you know, sort of the political landscape right now for. It's like, it's power politics, it's deconstructive, it's taking things apart, it's kind of all of those things. And he wants something new. He wants something that's kind of bigger. And he's saying like, we're in this world, like we're terraforming the planet Earth. Like these philosophies that we have been using just aren't adequate to that. Like we need to think of like, what is the role of the human now in this new landscape with all of this like planetary technology, planetary terraforming, climate change, viruses, the internet, artificial intelligence, all these things.
I did read the one part of that article I read where he used this kind of interesting metaphor of like pulling the bricks out of the road, like people are dismantling culture or society. And he's like, rather than throwing the bricks into the street, it's about like redesigning and rebuilding, like reusing those bricks in a new way. And I did think of that, like there is such a strong energy of deconstruction happening and tearing down all the systems, whether it's patriarchy or it's supremacy, the economic financial class. But it's the eternal question of are we just tearing down in order to tear down, or what are we building? What are we going to rebuild with those bricks if we're dismantling things? And does there need to be a clear plan, or is it an emergent instinct that we just know that something's old and we need to dismantle it? But then there's a real sense of uneasiness when there's no plan and no structure.
Well, I think what he's suggesting is that we need to sort of more consciously and rationally participate in what that emerging thing is, and maybe actually like our rational articulation of the thing is part of its emergence, right, into consciousness or into self-reflective awareness or something like that. And I think, you know, we've seen that in other movements. You know, this was, you know, I think it was even, you know, John Cobb doing the, you know, constructive postmodernism thing, like in the early 80s, you know.
Yeah, and David Ray Griffin.
Ray Griffin, and, you know, saying like Whiteheadians. We've had this whole period of sort of sustained critique, or, you know, Bruno Latour's famous essay from the early 90s has critique run out of steam, you know, all these things. I don't think anybody's really suggesting that critique needs to stop. It's just that like, we're in like a system building mode in some sense. And that means, I think for us, that means like speculative philosophy, or, you know, for artists, that means like new science fictions, writing a new kind of future. You know, what does that look like? And having that imagination, that, you know, kind of a rationally constructed imaginary, you know, like kind of like a paracosm, like what is plausibly ahead of us? What do we want to avoid? But what do we want to envision? And what do we want to create?
Yeah.
And I think part of what he's saying is that, and that technology plays a huge role in that. And we don't really theorize technological advance in terms of something like, you know, like what are our virtues? Like what is our notion of the good? You know, like, do we have a shared notion of the good? That's kind of one of those things that maybe has been lost, is like we don't have as robust a sense of like a good in itself, you know. This kind of stuff like Charles Taylor talks about all the time, like what there has to be some orienting good. And if we're going to continue to build these technologies, we need to figure out what that is and infuse that into the technologies themselves. And so there's, you know, all this role for speculative philosophical thinking to play there.
Yeah. Yeah. No, there are no sort of authoritative institutions left to critique or deconstruct. Like all of these institutions that we still depend on to survive are sort of these like withered skeletal forms of what they could and should be because of this endless critique and rejection and tearing down, throwing bricks. And now it's almost like there's no culture left to critique. We've literally lost our capacity to be cultural because we hated the tradition so much, that we, meaning like the 68 crowd, and like, you know, obviously none of us were alive then, but I remember coming of age as a college student and reading about the 60s counterculture and just being like, yeah, that's what needs to happen again. And like, why didn't it? But there's always this sort of nagging question, like, why didn't it work? Like, it failed clearly. Like, you know, there was a conservative rebellion, and
right,
and it got folded into capitalism, and like they were selling tie-dye shirts and Che Guevara shirts at the mall, and like, so what happened? I was asking that question too, and
well, that's what I was gonna say, is that it kind of, I don't know if it failed so much as it got incorporated.
Right.
You know, it's like it was, you know, the sort of the world economic system that sort of, you know, because I kind of see it as participating in the birth of like neoliberalism, like in the late 70s, early 80s, stuff like that. You know, it just those traditional bulwarks against turning everything into a market. You know, there were sort of sacrosanct things that, you know, shared goods that were a little bit, they had a resistance to politics and to economics. And like with the loss of those things, there's just what there is, our individual right as like sort of atomized little psyches to believe privately in things. But
Yeah.
the public dimension of those things kind of disappeared. And so like our sense of individual right to our interior beliefs is, in my mind, like the psychological position of neoliberalism. Like that kind of is what it is. You're free as like a consuming self to kind of be whoever you want to be, but the public space at large is now kind of off limits, because it's just kind of it's power, politics, and markets. I mean, that's what it is.
Yeah, it's almost like capitalism defeated the brown Nazis and the red communists by becoming the rainbow and like tie-dye. Like, in other words, becoming like social justice, identity politics, include everybody. Like, you can drink Pepsi and you can drink Coke and you can drink Mountain Dew and like have it your way, you know?
Yeah.
Everyone's included. We can all be consumers together. And sing in the the Coke commercial that Mad Men ends with. That's the neoliberal vision. And on the one hand, there's a lot of beauty in that, in this like romantic, beautiful soul sense, and yet it's a facade. It's very superficial because the material conditions are not rainbow coalition at all. They're enslaving people overseas to produce plastic products for us to buy at Walmart.
Yeah. And I think it's because just like our technology is kind of agnostic or atheist, our markets are too. They don't have, there's no good that they aim at, really. I mean, there are incidental goods, you know, like generating wealth and jobs. Of course, like people need money, and like that's a good that comes of it. But ultimately, the purpose of the market is the market. It doesn't point to anything outside of itself. The market's only goal is more market, you know?
Were there any cultures in, like, can a market ever have intrinsic relationships with the good? Like in other cultures, like, yeah, have there been markets where the good is included and oriented towards?
Like local markets, right? And then, yeah, you have a Silk Road and there's trade going on across localities, but an agora in the ancient Greek world where people are, selling locally produced foods and wares and crafts, and it's not that there can't be any trade across the world, but it needs to be much slower and not as much a like taken for granted norm that you can catch fish off the coast of Maine and ship it to China to ship it back to supermarkets in Washington. Like that seems not oriented towards the good. That's oriented towards exchange value of commodities and making profit by investing in the stock market in the company that's shipping all that shit around. There's no human reason. Actually, there are a lot of human reasons not to do that, but it makes money, so we do it, you know? So yeah, I think there are ways for markets to be oriented towards the good. It's just that the market has to know its place in the context of human life and not be the dominating factor.
Yeah. I mean, I see us as ultimately today sort of a society without a unified purpose or vision about where it's going or what it wants to do. I mean, I see, you know, the strength of a country like the United States is that we have that. I mean, it's structurally baked in to kind of on some level encourage a kind of diversity, you know, whether it's like just different states pursuing different things, but also individuals, you know, pursuing, you know, their own ends that other people find useful and uplifting. But in terms of like, you know, what I think Breton was saying was like, we need something like a moon program, but we need like a new moon program like every year. Like we need to be doing big things like that. And we need to like, why did we go to the moon? You know, ostensibly it's like this competition with, you know, the Soviets or whatever. I don't know this history well, but like, do you know what I'm saying? Like we didn't have to go to the moon, you know, but it's something that drove us to develop, you know, we had to develop a whole new sort of technological infrastructure at, you know, a pace we've never done before. I think the only things that like rival it are like these vaccines that we just created and maybe like the atomic bomb. Like we just set ourselves to it. We're like, okay, what do we need to do this? Like, we're kind of suspending normal rules, and we're just like kind of looking, you know, in that kind of first principles way. Like, if all we cared about was going to the moon, what would we need to do? Like, what stuff on Earth do we need to move around into the right places to get there? Like, forget about the money, forget about the hours, forget about, oh, you work here? No, actually, we would, you know, what would it take for you to leave your job and come, you know, work for us to figure out how to get this rocket to the moon? Okay, please come work with us. You're not doing that anymore. You're going to do like that kind of thing, you know? And like, you know, we have these sort of crises moments that drive us in those directions, but we could also just choose to kind of consciously do that, you know, instead of waiting for an explosion.
It's not that different, right, than like CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, right, where you kind of like you have a teenager smoking a lot of pot, playing video games in the basement, and it's like, let's just get you a job and like act like get them to like cohere and actualize into some real active plan. And I think that could certainly be true. I wonder about like in the West, at least, we've kind of mastered like the technology. We're very externalized. We're about doing. And I wonder about that, the Eastern traditions of being, or like I think of Jung, like the interior psyche. Like, you know, Jung would talk about what happens to societies when there's just such a lack of self-reflective and developmental growth, emotionally, spiritually, psychologically. And so I think it could be great for us to like have something we could all rally around and move towards in the outer world, like going to the moon or out into space. But I also have this nagging feeling like in the West, we've kind of gone off the rails. There is no, like, we've just kind of lost the mark. And I wonder how we can try and regain some kind of calibration. And I don't know, but I also feel like there's an inner piece, like turning inwards and reconnecting with, you know, like a navigational system and developmentally.
Yeah, I was thinking of asking you, Jesse, about what you might say in terms of like how to recover tradition spiritually, and engaging in things like meditation and prayer as a source of spiritual inward grounding in the midst of an outer world with all these material, economic, political problems, how much of all of that might be a side effect of people who don't have any handle on, you know, their soul, any relationship to their souls. And so, yeah, I mean, there's technological problems that we need to solve, but you know, what do you see as the role of like spiritual practice in all of this?
I mean, it's a great question. I don't know, but I do feel like that spiritual practice and a grounding is going to be essential. I mean, right? If we really believe, and I, you know, personally, I believe that, you know, you guys will be able to use vocabulary and language much better than me, but just consciousness, or there's something so much more, there's something that's just prior to what actualizes externally. And I don't, for some reason, as we were just talking, and a frequent image that comes into my mind is when I think of America, I do think of just the initial like birthing of America, like just these pilgrims and these pioneers coming across this country in wagons and just like massacring and dominating the native peoples living here and bringing slaves. And clearly there was a lot of wisdom and spirituality in Europe, but for some reason, when folks arrived on this continent, the Europeans, it just seemed like such a profound, disembodied, empty, lost, hungry ghost kind of a people arrived, and we've built since then. And I think we've done a lot of work, but I think there's a very deep level of work that needs to be done internally. I personally believe in a spiritual hierarchy that is the structure behind everything. So I think prayer and meditation, bringing us into into relationship with the underlying structures of psyche, really, the collective unconscious, you could call it, is a deeply spiritual concept, as Jung talked about it. But I think it's essential. I think spiritual technology, reconnecting with the mythopoetic vision, with the cosmology, with a sense of belonging in something much larger than ourselves, will be essential to finding our way through this moment in history where we are right now.
You said that word hierarchy, which is a bad word for a lot of leftist people. And I wonder if many people on the left who might identify as spiritual would still have some orientation to that domain that would be non-hierarchical. Like, and so that's an interesting thread to follow, perhaps. But I want to let's peg that and return to it. But I wanted to go back to what Adam was saying about like the moonshot as a way to unify human beings around a common purpose. And that I wanted to look up Kennedy's speech. I don't know if you guys have read that or heard him deliver that speech. It was when was it, 62? And it's great. He's like, we choose to go to the moon. He repeats it 3 times. We choose to go to the moon in this decade, not because it's easy, not because it's hard, but because the goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills, because that challenge is one that we are willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win. If that's not the best response to climate change and ecological catastrophe, like, it's a challenge that we have to accept, and there's going to be a technological component to it. But I do, getting back to Jesse's point, I worry about this like incessant desire to master nature and like expand and take control over more and more. And because it's like the whole history of Western civilization, to use a big abstraction that I think is still meaningful, even though it's been heavily critiqued by the 68 crowd. Western civilization has been marching westward, expanding as if on a plane and just going linearly like outward. And I think the desire to conquer space is a similar like expansive impulse. But the thing about the Earth is it's a sphere. And so there's really no escape. Pierre Teilhard de Chardin writes about this, the importance of the sphericality of the earth, in the sense that, yeah, humans left Africa and wandered around and met on the other side, and it creates this pressure.
Yep.
And so how do we recognize with technology too, this spherical nature of the powers we're dealing with, that they feed back on us, and we can't escape the effects of our actions. Even when we try to use technological instruments to change nature to suit our ends, there's always going to be an unexpected feedback that changes us. And so we're never the same with every new tool that we apply with an intention or a design to change the world, changes us in turn. And so it brings us back to this question of, how do we center ourselves? How do we ground ourselves? How do we, because we're never going to be able to predict what our actions will produce.
Right.
But we can come into relationship with ourselves and, I don't know, maybe understand our own intentions better, or act in a more contemplative manner, more sensitive to the complexity of the dynamics involved, more humble. I don't know, but it seems related to, what Jesse was just getting into, this critique of the expansion. Like, it's not a plane, it's a planet. So there's no escape. There's no escape, right? Like, we might get to Mars, but it's going to be really hard. And the first arc to Mars probably won't make it. There's going to be like, we need to learn how to do it by failing a few times first, is my guess. We'll see.
And we still need to continue living here.
And we still,
that's kind of just essential to the whole process. But you know what? I think if we go back to the idea of like infusing a conception of the good, a shared public conception of the good, our virtues, like building those into our technology and into our aspirations in a way that we're not really currently doing right now, like we said in the beginning, then we kind of combine the two, and I think this is one of the places where in Breton's piece we can push back on him, because there's a space in there where he essentially says that he didn't use the same examples that you used, Jesse. He spoke more of Husserl and Heidegger and these moves to kind of and there are several of them, kind of once we kind of embark on this mastery program over nature, over the planet Earth, over other animals, using technology, we quickly realize that the human being is continuous with nature, in a kind of post-Darwinian frame, and so that we are also subject to our own technological mastery, and that's a risk. And so there are all of these, the sort of the romantic counter reaction is to kind of, envision an anthropology where the human is irreducible to the, the functionings of mechanistic nature. There's something special about us, or, even if we achieve, some kind of higher level of, mastery of the genome or whatever, there's still this role for phenomenology or transcendental philosophy where, like, there's still that horizon upon which all of our scientific data must appear. So there's something special about us. And Breton is saying, like, this is the part I think we can push back on him at. He's saying this was a huge mistake. We should have just gone with Darwin. And Heidegger, we wasted 100 years on Heidegger and all of this stuff about, the clearing and disclosure and, the being for whom being is a concern. He was just saying, like, and the reaction was against reducing human beings to biological, molecular, chemical process. And he just kind of turns around and said, we shouldn't worry about that because that's all we are. And right there's a kind of an opening where you can kind of say, okay, I understand what you're saying about, taking on board the Darwinian picture and the evolutionary picture and a certain view of cosmology and placing humans in that context and not making us kind of stand out as an exception to everything else in nature. But that doesn't mean that, you have the right picture of nature and the cosmos, and that there isn't like some other vision, some other anthropology that's available there that kind of, I think, Matt, grows, directly out of, the kind of German idealist, Schelling, for example, like all the figures that you spend a lot of time with, there's a robust response there, from them, from Whitehead, from other folks. And we can put that back into the picture, and make that a part of the conversation, whilst also acknowledging the advances of the sciences. But then you're doing metaphysics. And that's where we need a better metaphysics. And he's talking about, we need durable abstractions. You need some kind of like functioning world model that you can use to kind of guide your experiments and build your technologies to, like, kind of see in the dark a little bit what you're doing. And then, the models break and they don't work. And so then, like, you get a little feedback loop right there where, like, the technology reveals something, the experiment reveals something that you didn't expect. And so now you need to, like, re-engineer a new abstraction, or, maybe grow a new abstraction, whatever metaphor you want to use. But to keep that metaphysical image open, and not just treat it as a foregone conclusion that, like, mechanism is the case, because it very much seems like it's not the case.
Yeah, I love that metaphor, durable abstraction, but I would add we also need viable abstractions. In other words, abstractions that are live options, as James would say, William James, for us as human beings. Like, so durable, to me, durable abstractions, I like the pragmatist ring of that, but it needs to be more than just durable. It needs to be livable, in the sense that we can be engaged in meaningful lives, even though we know scientifically that nature behaves in this way. So my short sort of response to Breton would be, yeah, I agree, humans are not special, and nature is not mechanical.
But why aren't we special?
Well, we could talk about freedom, moral freedom. I think that is a spot that is hard to, I don't know that, is there any other animal that we hold morally responsible for its actions?
I mean, probably. Obviously not in the same way that we hold other humans responsible, but I mean, I think...
and even we'd want to be compassionate with humans too. Like, sometimes, a human is in an extreme condition that's not totally their fault, and they do something rash, and we can understand that and maybe not punish them as severely or whatever. I'm against the death penalty. So when I say, like, moral or hold someone accountable for their actions, it's more like we expect people to be able to orient themselves towards the good. And so we feel personally responsible for our actions.
Yeah.
I don't know that other animals necessarily feel that sense of moral responsibility. So I'm just saying there might be something special about the human, but it's going to be a further elaboration upon something that's inchoate, or
we're continuous with, like, we're certainly, part of that process, and share in whatever dynamics are a part of nature are also kind of a part of the functioning of our bodies. And, our whole evolutionary history grows out of that process. So, I mean, we're connected to it in that sense. But I think that's one of those things that we can revisit. If, like, you want a new anthropology, there's, that kind of, like, I'm not saying that this is how you came off, but it's in the discourse, and it's in conversations around, like, humans aren't special, or in fact, humans are bad, really, sort of irrevocably so. And we are bad. There is that side to us, but there's also our redemptive side. There's also, the side of us that is striving towards the good, that is working to better ourselves and other people. And, maybe in the context of this conversation, on some level, even the planet, and that's true of us as well.
It makes me think, Adam, about, in one of our other conversations, we kind of spoke about there could be this cynicism and this kind of just, I don't know if it's nihilism, cynicism, that the tendency to critique, dismantle. There can be some way in which it can slide from a productive critique, a productive, like, seeking synthesis, into just a angry, bitter, I think of Jordan Peterson, that kind of the bitter, resentful, just cynicism, and how that's taken root across the political divide. And I think it's deeply connected to this conversation in terms of meaning making. When people don't have a sense of meaning, if people don't feel rooted in something larger, whatever that is, a story, a cosmology. I think it can easily feed this emptiness. And when that happens, it's just almost like everything starts unraveling and we're all trying to figure out what is causing what. And the whole thing is feels to me like it starts to unravel. And we're all trying to make sense of it. And to your point, Matt, when we started talking, it's like it is. I have that same sense. It's getting harder and harder to try to understand what is happening. It's so complex. And how do we even begin? But that feels connected to this conversation.
I think that's right. And there was actually, I wrote, I don't know, maybe 2 years ago, a short essay in response to something that was published in Aeon, the online philosophy magazine. I forget what the title of the piece was, but it was basically a defense of what the author was calling depressive realism. And the argument was similar to what you were just kind of describing, Jesse, where it was I believe it was a psychologist, a psychoanalyst, perhaps. I think actually like a sort of like a Lacanian kind of continental psychoanalyst figure. She was arguing that people's depression is justified because it actually gears you into a more authentic, more realistic relationship to the world. So that your feelings of depression aren't like kind of your internal subjective projection that needs fixing. It's actually a more real model of how things actually are. And, the world is this, horribly misshapen, kind of fallen place. And your depression is actually an accurate appraisal of that. And I just pushed back on it just really hard, just because knowing what that to me kind of was the quintessential lock of depression. That is essentially what it does to you. Like, speaking as a person who's been, at varying levels of depressed, maybe, significantly so in my teenage years and, at various points in my life. But that's its primary characteristic, is that it comes off as being very real, and it brings with it not just depression and cynicism, but often like sort of deep misanthropy, and the disconnection, the alienation, and all of those kinds of things. And there's this tendency again in the sort of the philosophical discourse, mostly kind of post-continental philosophy folks, where this kind of stuff is right there, and it's kind of valorized in a very negative way, where, just like depression is kind of given this sort of privileged status as giving you access to the real, things like alienation are too. So like the conditions
people
of
who are happy are critiqued as being privileged.
Stupid. Well, privileged, but also just dumb. Like they don't get it. And the, if you look at, and this is where it comes back, Jesse, into contemplative practice, because if you look at what is afforded by alienation, by your own alienation from yourself and alienation from other people, depression, dissociation, depersonalization, that kind of distancing from your own thoughts and feelings and your own interactions in the world, there are aspects of those states of mind that are similar to like contemplative states, like, sort of just being a witness to what's happening, to what's rising and falling, just kind of being aware of it, but not identifying with it. And I think we kind of stepped into, because of all these other unhealthy sort of social, political, economic factors that kind of drive people into this alienation. A lot of people have confused the sort of the contemplative observational state, the kind of more being in touch with, awareness, not identifying with, thoughts, feelings, emotions as they kind of rise and fall. For me, there's a big tie in here with like transcendental philosophy, the type of stuff that Kant does, that Husserl does, Heidegger does, but in a negative way, in a really psychologically unhealthy way that isn't the kind of like, healthy, open-hearted kind of healing that also comes along with, intentional contemplative practice, even though it gives you some of the same insights. Like you do in fact get an interesting slant on things that is meta. It is a little bit, it is a little bit askance from, just immersed first person experience. But it's tied in with this, like, we've basically succumbed to depression and anxiety as sort of like default and privileged states of thinking. And I think that's really just damaging and dangerous. And, you see it in people, actually, like it makes them sick and it makes them cynical. And sometimes it drives them to suicide and addiction and all these other things. It's a little rant, but I mean, I think it's important to talk about.
Were you going to say something, Matt?
Just that depression is, I think, in some important sense, a developmental achievement. But if you get stuck there, it becomes pathological. In other words, like as a teenager, usually you're going to experience some depression at some point for the first time, like a real depression. And there's certain emotional capacities and strengths that are developed in that. And I feel like it's important to go through it and not to get stuck in it, right? So I want to validate melancholia and this Saturnian reality principle. I mean, it's no coincidence that depression and this reality principle notion are Saturnian in their archetypal valence, right? So it is an important perspective, but if you get stuck there, then you're missing out on the rest of the spectrum of existence too.
And that was like when I published that, or published it, I just posted it online. That was, people that I kind of knew and didn't know, in the online world, especially people that didn't know me previously, or you kind of didn't know where I was coming from. They kind of had that attitude that I was like just dismissing the experience of depression and anxiety and alienation and all these things, which wasn't what I was trying to do at all. You need to feel those things, and you need to figure out what's going on. Like, why are you feeling this way? Why are you chronically feeling this way? And that, takes tools, therapy, there's a variety of ways of dealing with it. But my point wasn't that those aren't valuable states. They're also valuable states, and they do disclose things about reality that are important. But we get into a dangerous place when we valorize them as privileged modes of access, to the detriment of other modes, and it's kind of like a little bit the inverse of sort of like extreme American positive psychology, where there's just like the opposite kind of privileging. Positive thinking is everything. That can become pathological. So it's that kind of thing, right? Where you want to stay open to the different ways that kind of being or the real or whatever discloses itself through emotional and affective states, in addition to, the cognitive and intellectual and conceptual resources that you kind of bring to it. Because they're there, and, reality shows up in different ways depending on mood, and Heidegger, famously thematizes angst in that context. We could also thematize joy, for the same reason.
Yeah. I mean, I was just thinking of, it's almost like a great analyst, psychologist, psychiatrist knows when the right move is. When is the depression appropriate and developmentally needed to like drop down from the mania? When is it important to get pulled out of the morass of a depressive paralysis? I was thinking of both Rick Tarnas's, kind of diagram of we're entering into this collective descent, and just like there was the heroic solar phase of maybe that's the Enlightenment or something, and now we're through the postmodern situation, maybe going into a depressive kind of dark night, the catabasis in Greek, like this descent move. And it's also what I always enjoyed about James Hillman is he talked about the manic quality of the American, it's like, good morning with your coffee and your just like the morning radio, everything's in major. There's no minor songs and minor tones. It's just like everything amped up. And electric lights and 24/7, and so he was a big advocate for the dissent, in the sense that going into a depression can be a real healthy reaction. And so there's always a part of me that believes in that, and maybe that's what we're witnessing collectively. Some unraveling is, maybe it's a natural response to a overly, heroic kind of, I don't know what, but yeah, that's an interesting perspective too.
I think that's right. But I think, like if you look at it just concretely, especially in the past year, what COVID has done to all of these kind of existing trend lines, like suicide and addiction and drug overdose, just watching all the lines go up, if we are in a kind of a descent period collectively, it's probably important psychologically, like you're saying, to have those experiences and to go through that, and to like view it as not just a reaction, but an appraisal. Like I like the idea that, your emotional states are also like intelligent assessments of things that are happening. They're perceptual events in that sense. It's like, what is it that you're becoming aware of that's having the effect of you feeling this way? But also, like you're saying with the therapist, like how do you need to have some skillful means there, where like I think about the role of a spiritual director, on the path of, religious development. Spiritual directors are very, important guides on the contemplative path. This kind of stuff happens through contemplative practice as well. And so to have something like that for the culture, this is the kind of thing that Pierre Hadot will kind of recover as like an important element of the philosopher. The philosopher has an obligation to kind of diagnose, like a doctor, like what's happening to the city, what's happening to the society, and have some means there, acting as that kind of spiritual director, in the context of like also accepting like your own ignorance, your own inability to kind of know finally what's happening, but to understand that there are better and worse ways to go through these things. And that right now we seem to be in like dire need of a kind of collective contextualization of what's happening, because of this tremendous suffering.
Can we get that collective contextualization when we're so like mediated by our little reality tubes or reality screens? I mean, it's like, it seems to me that there's a technological, I'm not a technological determinist necessarily, but it's pretty evident that this newly like miniaturized form of computational networked media has had some consequences politically and now financially. Like the last 4 years was the political consequence of social media and its transformation of our human existence. And now it's now the economy that's being turned upside down. I think maybe that's what the next couple of years is going to be about. Politics has been swallowed by social media, and next it's capitalism. And what does this world look like on the other side of that? I mean,
and what do you think that could look like, Matt? Like if you're thinking of the last 4 years on the political landscape, just thinking out loud for the next few years, if it connected with capitalism and the economy, what do you think that could look like?
Well, it seems that the Janet Yellens of the world are losing the reins over the economy, and the corporate CEOs and the hedge fund managers are losing the reins. It's their economy created the technologies that are undermining their own handle on power. And I don't know who's going to take over. Will it be a more distributed economy where it's like a truly free market, in the sense that more people have the means to participate in the production process? Or will it just be masses of people, even more than with television and the internet now, just passively consuming? I don't know. I mean, I really don't know. I don't know what it's going to look like. There's like a transcendental wall blocking me from, I literally feel like we don't have the cognitive organs to even begin to perceive where we already are, much less where we're going. So I don't know. I mean, we need
It seems
to,
like it's an important element, just like the online interaction, just like even being able to have this conversation.
mhm.
And I know that that's been, pretty big for myself and a lot of other people, just to be able to kind of keep in touch and to make sense together, and to you just kind of bounce assessments and test ideas with each other, like in a year like 2020 that was just so just nuts, and marked with not just like chaotic events, but really low trust in a lot of spaces, really low trust that we were getting good information, that everybody, people in places of power were truly doing things in the interest of the public good. We had the protests halfway through it, and then the fires here in California, and the whole while, not just dealing with those like demanding events, but also kind of questioning like our sense of the reality of the thing. And then, as we've discussed offline, quite a bit, just watching people kind of go off the deep end into like, echo chambers, becoming kind of conspiracy theories, becoming kind of just like hijacked minds, doing really wild stuff like we saw on January 6th and so on. So, I mean, all of that's like kind of happening in tandem. There's like connection and sense making and collective intelligence, but also like these like widespread, like, conspiracy communities kind of hitting the mainstream. And it can't be the only thing. Like at some point you have to you kind of have to get on board with like what folks like Jason Snyder are doing, where like they have this online presence, but they're also homesteaders, and they're also building resilient kind of lives in local communities, physical local communities. So you need both, I think, to kind of check the meta picture, the big picture. There's so many of these events that you can't actually kind of cognize and perceive as an individual human. We actually need, like, climate change is a good example of that, but just like, a global pandemic, like you can't see that as a person. So you need lots of eyes and lots of little sensors and lots of little feedback loops, like going back and forth to like kind of capture the thing, in action. But you also need neighbors and, face-to-face interactions and friends. And so like, there's a balance there that we need to figure out. But I wanted to share, actually, I'm glad you brought up Yellen and the Wall Street thing. Actually, well, I'll pull this up. Maybe one of you have some thoughts, but I wanted to read a couple of paragraphs from this Wall Street Bets page. They started posting people who benefited from the situation and what they benefited from and why they were involved. And some of them are pretty interesting, but I don't know if you want to say anything.
Yeah.
I read it.
Sure.
Do it.
Yeah. Okay. So this is from these are just screenshots from our Wall Street Bets. And this one just says Gamestop, why this time is different. Open letter to Wall Street and CNBC. And I think, everybody don't believe anything that you see on the internet, but like, I don't have any reason to doubt that this is authentic. And if it's just somebody kind of playing up a narrative, it's the right narrative. So I wanted to read it. It just says, Dear Wall Street and CNBC, you have been calling this a speculative bubble, that GameStop will ultimately crash down to earth, and that the little guys are going to get hurt. Jim Cramer wants us to take your home run and sell. You use words like fundamentals and valuations and say that the stock price is not justified. Here's the fundamental. I'm an ER doctor that trained in inner city Detroit. When I was a resident physician, Obama was president. During his presidency, the quality of life of the predominantly African Americans in the city did not improve. Despite Obamacare, I saw little improvement in the health outcomes of the patients I worked with. I saw continued proliferation of illicit drugs, overdoses, and gang violence. You have left these people behind. I spent the last several years working in a small town in the Midwest when Trump was president. During his presidency, the quality of life of the predominantly white Americans also did not improve and have in fact worsened. I saw continued proliferation of illicit drugs, overdoses, and suicides. These patients I care for are also people whom you have left behind. With the pandemic, I have seen those who are already at the brink of financial solvency lose their jobs, and I see lines outside the food banks. I see the health outcomes of my patients decline as they forego preventative care. I, on the other hand, kept my job, got a raise, and saw the value of my 401k rise as the economy crashed around me. Going to work every day is a constant and stark reminder of the brokenness and disparity of the economic system and my sheer powerlessness to change it. I realize now that it is not political. It is you. I own Gamestop because it represents something to me. It is the very embodiment of the millennial generation that you have left behind. A down and out aging retailer that you feel is no longer worth investing in. We are GameStop. We are not selling because we believe in ourselves and investing in ourselves. We want to see it succeed. It goes on and on like that, but you kind of get the point. If you are a politician or a regulator reading this, don't listen to their bullshit. If you intervene, stop trading of GME, bail out hedge funds and big banks like you have in the past, and try to placate us by dragging a few hedge fund managers in front of a congressional hearing. You'll unite the entire country against you. Make sure you are on the right side of this. You work for us too.
That's awesome. I wish I was reading that in the New York Times. I haven't read all their coverage of this, but in general, they're very disparaging of the nerds who internet mob that's causing havoc in the markets, as if they're just doing it for the lulz. It seems like there's a much deeper political motivation here that is right on point. I mean, that was very well. That's the story right there. Very well narrated.
Yeah, and I
think
think
it's going to be interesting to see how the Democrats respond.
But it seems like it's also kind of an interesting multi-class event, because other people have pointed out like, hey, there were some big buys made. Some of those guys in the Reddit forum, like, they're painting this like it's some working class thing where people are buying $50 worth of shares, but somebody, people are making $50,000, $100,000 buys. They were like, something's wrong here. But I think what's happening is that like this doctor, they're just like, whatever, man, this is an opening. This is like an opening to make some noise and wreak some havoc. And, what I thought could be accomplished by politics, I no longer believe can be done that way. So now we're here. Now we're doing this,
Right. If you can fuck over the hedge funds and make a lot of money at the same time, it's like, what do you got to lose?
Yeah, there was another guy in the same. I mean, the thread is really interesting. There was another guy who made like $4,000 and like was able to like get his dog's knee replacement surgery or whatever, and like the dog can walk again, and he's like crying because like he's broke, and it's just like, like you just spend some time reading the thread, and you're like, okay, all right, guys.
What was the meme of like the the
keep at it,
like hiding and like shaking under the desk and like some like Terminator.
Oh right, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it is interesting. There's a thread, there's like a similar parallel dimension to this that, does remind me of the political move. I mean, with Trump, regardless of how one might think of Trump, there was this tapping into a much larger collective discontent and like this sense of enough. And I think the Democrats really misread that. And I think I, for one, just thought there was no way Trump could ever become the nominee, let alone the president of the United States. Mm-hmm. Yeah, there it is. Nice. Yeah, Robinhood traders, $600 semi-tech checks in the hedge. I mean, so, but there is that same sense of what we just saw with GameStop. And, you know, regardless of what happens with it itself, there was this tremendous potency just on a collective, like cultural level. And I think it could really be a significant cultural moment that we'll look back on. And I think you're right, Matt, it's probably heralding something to come. And, you know, you had
Think
the
about
Bitcoin pump right after, it kind of like transferred into crypto a little bit.
right. Well, just think about the what's learned from what Wall Street Bets just did by tar sands activists. I was just listening to a talk that a PCC student gave. They're Canadian and they're activists working against the tar sands. And I just thought, I wonder if there's a way to go after the stock of these companies. Like if you can't really stop the industrial might with the state behind it, Trudeau saying, oh yeah, climate change is real, we got to do something about it. And meanwhile, he's like green lighting this totally stupid, not even that profitable tar sands operation that's destroying the most beautiful land you've ever seen and pushing indigenous people off the land. And is there a way to manipulate the stock of these companies with sort of distributed network attacks?
That's what people. I think that's kind of like the story is. Well, there's a couple pieces to it. One, there's just like the sheer energy behind it, and then there's like the response, like, oh, well, this is actually bad for markets, and that could be bad for people because if you crash the
Elizabeth
market,
Warren's
then,
response was
and there's like just as far as I understand things, there's truth to that, right? Like you can crash things, and that, you know, the 2008 crash wasn't good for people, you know, and it's not good for retirements and things like that. So there is that, but people aren't, when they're making that analysis, they're not getting that this isn't a move made on that level of rational self-interest. It's more of like you've forced my hand. And so now we found this weird little mechanism by which we can leverage some power. And it's not like, oh, we're gonna make some money quick, or we're gonna, like, you know, go gambling at the casino. It's like, we're gonna fuck with you. Like, that's the whole thing, like targeted fucking with people. And but that's the move that they saw, because you could potentially do that. And the argument that, you know, this guy was responding to in his message that I just read was that, like, the market analysts are saying this isn't good because that's not the actual value of this stock. You know, you've created a false value that doesn't actually correspond to its real value, and that's bad. And so that's going to create a bubble, and that blah blah blah. But that's the thing that people discovered, is that, like, wow, you can fake values, you can push them up and down like this.
Yeah,
if you
I don't think
just have,
GameStop's the only thing that's valued more than it really should be.
right, and but that's like the counter argument is like, right, because everything else is actually correctly valued.
They just gave us the best argument against capitalism.
Yeah,
right?
but to your point, Matt, like that's I think what people saw is like, oh, if you just get, if as many people had trading apps as had Facebook's apps, then you can make stocks rise and fall left and right just by moving large amounts of money, like in this kind of coordinated mean fashion.
It just hit me that under corporate capitalist rule, this is like the new way of voting.
That's the connection that I've seen people make, that like the early commentary is like, you have a new vote, essentially. Mm-hmm. And it's analogous to,
especially if you have UBI that you can use, you know.
Well, that's the other thing that people are commenting on, is that, like, we're getting another round of stimulus checks, and the thought is like, maybe those will all just go into, you know, these kind of weird sort of market manipulations. But that's, as far as I understand it, that's the kind of the sort of more meta level analysis, is like, what causal relationships were just actually established here that aren't like these particular empirical cases, but like, what's the formal structure that just sort of revealed itself. And it's something like, just like Twitter gave everybody kind of a voice, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram gave everybody a kind of like media voice on some level. This incident makes everybody a kind of a market trader, in the same way that prior to this, only even though anybody could potentially go in and buy stocks, it's not like a super widespread thing in terms of like number of people doing it in the population. This kind of does, in the same way that YouTube and Twitter has now made everybody potentially a kind of a media personality or a newspaper person. This has done that to economics and the stock market. And so now, of course, they need to, just like we're having all these conversations about like, free speech, like some of these people are saying things we don't want them to say, and like we don't have the kind of tight narrative control that we used to have when it was just, you know, Fox and MSNBC, CBS or whatever, New York Times, Wall Street Journal. Now we have like just hundreds of thousands of minor voices, some of them saying absolutely abhorrent shit. But the point is, it sort of democratized that participation in a way that we've never really seen before. And so now that's happening on with like markets and money and moving things. I think that's the larger story.
It is like doing a similar thing of erosion of trust, right? Because, you know, again, I'm not quite clear what happened with the Robinhood app. Like, you know, you could only sell, you couldn't buy, and they don't know whether that was a liquidity crisis or they were being leaned on by somebody to do that. But regardless, there was that whole thing about like 100,000 or 200,000 reviews of Robinhood. They put like a single star review, and Google just erased like 100 or 150,000 of these reviews. So then it's kind of like, okay, where does that lead? That's not going to do anything good in this situation except further erode trust, because now you can't even have your review up there. And I think of Eric Weinstein sometimes. It's like, it's just this runaway train where the more whoever the elite are, the people in power, they're trying to keep things in order, and they just becomes more and more apparent to everybody else what's happening. And it will be interesting to see what happens now that this is playing out in the financial sector as well.
Yeah, I think it'll be interesting to see how many of those things play out. Like I'm not clear on exactly what, like you were saying, what happened with Robinhood. Like, I don't know. I don't have a full clear picture on that. I'm skeptical. I look skeptically when they're saying that like, oh, the reason that you think that the app was shut down isn't, or the trades were shut down isn't the reason that the conclusion that you're all jumping to. That's not right. It was this kind of liquidity thing or whatever. Or like, I saw the thing about the Google reviews too. And I'm like, is that going to hold? Is that real? Like you know, when you're following a story like this, it's like so many pieces are moving so quickly, and so many sub components of the narrative start going viral. Like there's the initial thing about Wall Street bets, but then there's this viral branch of it that's about like the Google reviews getting taken down. And so like you get all of these, like, it's just a crazy proliferation of takes and things. And like, I'm interested to see like in a week or two, looking back, like which one of those, like what solidifies, like what ends up sticking, what ends up being like sort of the case about like what's the best take at the end of the day on how all of these things played out. But it's definitely like somebody punched a hole through a wall and connected two pieces of the world that previously weren't connected. And now they seem to be like a little bit kind of fused together. And that's just a part of things now, you know? And we're going to see, you know, this kind of like arms race between, you know, like traders and, you know, Wall Street bets types and regulators and technology companies. And, you know, they need to put some fences around this thing and figure out how to get it to move. And it's going to be interesting because even if like the sort of utopian kind of energy behind this like ends up getting taken down several notches, just watching Yellen and the SEC come out, and you know the tech companies' responses, like these events, like the hidden wiring behind things like has to show up because like things are breaking. So you can see the kind of control apparatus coming in to try and assert itself. So if nothing else, you get to sit back and take some notes about what's coming into the foreground. You see, oh, okay, so you see people over here protecting these interests, people over here protecting those interests. Oh, these assumptions that I had about these things, I can now kind of like empirically watch things unfold. And who are the actors in the White House now? What are their interests? Like, things reveal themselves in these kinds of moments. And that to me is, you know, worth just as much as whatever the actual event itself is, because it illuminates so much of what's around it and what you're actually dealing with in a way that you don't see when things like this aren't happening. This is like that whole structure can just kind of recede into the background.
Right. It was interesting to hear that Janet Yellen was paid $800,000 apparently by Robinhood a couple of years ago for a talk she gave and some financial advice, I guess.
I heard she deserved that. So
right. So it's like, that's one of those sort of strings you wouldn't have noticed unless this all happened. And you know, who else has she been paid ungodly sums of money for, you know, a half-hour talk? This became an issue in 2016 with Hillary, and giving talks to the banks that made her, I mean, she's already a multi-millionaire, but, you know, just to get paid as a politician and get paid by all these companies that you obviously then go do favors for when you have power, is not something that people are going to keep putting up with. And yet it keeps, it's as if the people in power right now on Wall Street think they're invincible. And this shows that there's a chink in the dragon's armor. And there's, as far as I can tell, no one has any good ideas how to like cover that chink up again. It's just going to keep getting expanded. And it's a tremendous vulnerability that changes the game. And maybe that's, I don't know if I'm hopeful about that or afraid of what it might mean, because there's a lot of chaos actors out there who really just want to, you know, do it for the lulls. Right. That's a factor. There's also people like that ER doctor. It's just a matter of like, how does this newfound voting technology get operationalized, and who are the majorities? What are the publics that will form, and what will their aims be, and how will the market manipulations affect, you know, the grocery store, or affect jobs and stuff like that. I mean,
I think like one thing that's you can probably bet on is that this pushes us further towards encryption. You know, just, you know, because they shut down that Discord. They're definitely going to make like coordinating and communicating about these things more difficult. They have those levers already. They can monitor those conversations. So, I mean, I think it obviously accelerates the drive towards encrypted communication, and then, you know, also cryptocurrency probably.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, we'll see how it plays out, but for sure, I think what a lot of people are taking away from this whole Gamestop thing and is like, yeah, encryption and security and privacy. And, you know, there's the fact that if you're buying stocks, you don't own those actual stocks. The brokerage owns the stocks. And if you're doing crypto, you can own your actual coins and you can hold them securely yourself. You can send them to whomever you want, whenever you want. You don't have to ask permission. You don't have to wait for the weekday. You don't have to go through a bank wiring. You know, you can just send it anywhere, anytime. And I do think there's a really good use case scenario for that. And I think more and more people are really wanting that. And it's going to be interesting to see how it plays out. But, you know, Dogecoin exploded. I think it was the day after GameStop or something. It's all kind of blurry at this point, but
yeah,
it's interesting. It's an interesting time, that's for sure.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to run in a few minutes here, but that's my hope for cryptocurrency, which, you know, I'm still learning new things about it and its potential and all the various coins and what they do and why they're valuable aside from just being a speculative commodity. And the shift to a new kind of world computer that is this encrypted ledger, and the way that it decentralizes everything from currency to contracts to whatever else. If we can, I didn't know that about stocks being held by the brokerage or owned technically by the brokerage. That's interesting, because the idea of getting banks and brokerages out of that middleman role so that people can just engage with one another in a market without any intermediaries who are skimming off profit, simply for, like, banks just make money because they already have a bunch of money. And it's like, there's clearly, there was a primitive accumulation, at some point in the past. And these people got to be the bankers. And it's like, well, how is that part of a democratic form of self-governance?
Mm-hmm.
And I think potentially crypto could move us in that direction. Potentially. I mean, there's also the whale problem.
Well, I was going to say crypto has the same primitive accumulation problem. The people, that's one of the things that, I mean, if you want to take a critical look at it, that's, I think, the first place to go is to just acknowledge that, the vast majority of the value of cryptocurrencies is owned by a very small number of people.
Yeah.
So in that respect, you're reproducing a lot of dynamics.
Three dudes could change the price of Bitcoin by 50% probably by just deciding to do it one day.
And so to some extent, like, and that's what people say about, the volatility and stuff like that. So to some extent, you still have these kind of, feudal overlords kind of making things happen. But I don't think there's no situation where we're not going to have something like that dynamic. We inherit history, we inherit the past, and those inequalities exist. And so whatever we transfer into, whatever transformations occur, there's going to be a group of people who's better positioned to take advantage of them than other people. And so we have to live with that fact. And we have to, just like all these other things that we've been talking about, we have to meet that reality and do something consciously about it, or at least just pretend. I feel like the least we can do is not pretend like we've just left behind, all of those inequalities because we're excited about cryptocurrencies or whatever. We could at least keep that critical eye on it, and then see where else we can take it.
Yeah. And I think it offers up some new avenues, but there's a way in which we're just bringing an old setup to something new. I do think the volatility will change. I think as it matures as a market, it's like a lot of stocks are extremely volatile, especially when they're young and new. And I think when people call crypto or Bitcoin out for its volatility, it's like, okay, it's true. And as it matures over time and grows, I think it will just become less and less volatile. But yeah, we'll see. It's interesting moment.
Definitely. I feel like we had a pretty balanced and insightful exchange. So appreciate it, guys. Let's do this more often.
Yeah, it was fun.
Yeah, awesome to see you guys and wrap. And let's do it again soon.
Yeah, definitely.